And to discuss the topic, military takeover in Gabon, let's welcome Ambassador Joe Keshi. Ambassador Keshi is a seasoned diplomat and former permanent secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Good morning and welcome, sir.
Good morning. Nice to be with you.
And with us as well here in the studio is Dr. Adoyi Matthew Omale. He's a lecturer at the International Relations and Diplomacy Department of the Bayes University. We're glad to have you too.
Yeah, good morning.
Okay, and there are two other guests who are joining us from various locations. From our Lagos Network Center, let's welcome Dr. Kester Ono. Is a senior research fellow at the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs, the visiting lecturer at the Institute of Peace, Security and Development Studies at Nnamdi Azikiwe University, Awka. Dr. Ono, we're glad to have you this morning.
Having me in the program.
Joining us via Zoom from Paris in France is George Ola Davis, a veteran Sierra Leonean journalist who's worked for many years in Nigeria and an international political negotiator. And of course, he's also worked extensively in mainly Francophone Africa. George, we're glad that you are with us via Zoom this morning from Paris.
Good morning to you all.
All right, let's begin with you, George. You're reaching us from France, and we'd like to know what the atmosphere is at the government level in France, if you have any such information, with respect to what happened early morning on Wednesday in Gabon. Of course, Gabon is known to be one of the countries colonized by France. And again, we know that there are bilateral relations, in many ramifications between France and Gabon. So what can you tell us about the atmosphere in France with respect to this development?
Well, it's a mixed reaction that they've got here in France. But first and foremost, the government itself condemned the coup outright and went on to request that authorities be restored, that is, the civilian authorities, democratically elected government be restored. But there are those who questioned the Electoral Commission's publication and the relationship between Paris and Libreville had not been in the best of shapes in recent years. So the reaction here in France has been actually mixed.
Let's still mind some information from you. What had been wrong, as it were, with the relationship between Libreville and Paris in recent years, as you indicated?
Well, let's take it away from the current administration and we go back to that of President Jacques Chirac, who was a very close friend of the late President Omar Bongo Ondimba. That relationship continued until Nicolas Sarkozy came onto power and they started seeing some withdrawal of the Gabonese from the French in the country over to areas like China, and Gabon became a member of the Commonwealth. And during the tenure of office of President François Hollande, the relationship was really very cold. There was hardly any visit, in fact, to Paris by President Ali Bongo Ondimba. You would see that he's been going over to Morocco, Spain and Saudi Arabia. In fact, he contracted his stroke in Saudi Arabia and spent nearly a year out of the country. So the relationship has been really cold, especially again against the economic background of what things have been. Now, France is interested in Gabon, has been interested in Gabon for economic and political reasons. Mainly political reason, Gabon remains a stronghold in the Central African region, where you have countries like Central Africa that had swayed away from France. Cameroon has also been away from France, getting away from France. And so Gabon was the centerpiece for their peace structure, noting also that there are about 350 French soldiers in the Gabonese territory who cannot do anything anyway. They're there and they've been there. We don't know what is going to happen when the new administration really sits on whatever they want to do with the country. And when it came over to President Macron, yes, Macron was in Gabon recently for a conference having to do with forests, and was ushered in to talk to the Central African government by President Ali Bongo. But the relationship has actually not been so cold, not been so warm. It has been tenderly cold.
All right, thank you for giving us that background information with respect to the relationship between the two countries. Now, back here to the studio, let me ask Ambassador Joe Keshi to weigh in on this with respect to all the information he gave us this morning. We never knew, actually, that there was a good relationship between France and Gabon, and it's for some years now. What do you make of that?
No, he's right. There's been this very cold relationship, but I don't think that it's because of the cold relationship that this, coups do occur. At least this one may have been precipitated by the result of the, election, which goes back to, the conversation I believe we've had here the last time we were here on Niger, that, if our institutions, fail to do the right thing, particularly on issues of election, you probably have things like this, happening here and there. And I remember the last time I was here in Niger and we were trying to advise the government and ECOWAS to, slow down and do this thing diplomatically, that I did pose the question, if there's a coup, and there will be coups anyway, sooner than later somewhere else, what will we do? And here we are dealing with the issue of Gabon. But essentially, I do not think it's because of the cold relationship that this thing is happening. We must consistently see these coup issues as a result of some internal contradictions in the states where it has occurred. He has ruled for 14 years or thereabout. His father ruled for 40 years or 42 years. The man in Congo DR, it's almost everlasting. Museveni is almost 40 years. If there's a coup in any of these countries, who will be surprised? Because they have refused to leave. There's been no transition. And in some cases, the economy is also not doing well. So if the military decide that, and look, we need to be very careful, our leaders need to be very careful, because I made a point here the last time I was here that when it started in Togo, coup started in Togo in the 50s, throughout most of the 60s, from 1, 2, 3, it became fashionable. So you might actually, there are some countries you begin to wonder, was it necessary to have staged a coup or not? Because things were going on very well. But it became a fashion and every military guy, felt the bug. And so this is exactly what we need. Our leaders need to be very careful. And to tell you that they are beginning to realize it, Cameroon has, the leader of Cameroon has reshuffled his military. I think Uganda has done something similar. The question is it the military that you have to reshuffle, or begin to transit yourself out and allow the country, democracy to flourish in the country, and allow development to flourish? You spend 14 years, in some cases 40 years. Poverty is still ravaging most of these countries. And that's the issue.
Ambassador Joe Keshi, thank you very much. Let's go over to our Lagos Network Center, where we introduced earlier Dr. Kester Onoh, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs. What is your framing of what has happened in Gabon against the backdrop of earlier occurrences, Guinea-Conakry, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, which everyone is still grappling with, and to an extent Chad and Sudan. Is it a domino effect?
Thank you very much. Nobody actually support, the ongoing queues or the rate of queues in both in Sahel region in West Africa and now Central Africa inclusive. But when we look at the failing institutions, we look at the deficiency in governance and, again, we look at, apart from the domino effect, it's like many African leaders have taken a periodic election as sign of democracy without knowing that when we talk about democracy, it's all encompassing. And democracy is meant for the people. And that's why it is defined as government of the people, for the people, and, So it's actually the involvement of the people. So if you look at some of these places that you has taken place, and you equally look at French policy on their Francophone African countries, you discover that, a new breed of Africans are coming up, and felt that some of the policies from France are actually choking. So they are now deciding to take the bull by the horn. However, it's not to say that even military, regime is better than democracy. But what we are saying is that let's call a spade a spade. If we want to practice democracy, I believe it's a serious sign for African leaders, for them to come together. I know that when we are talking about democracy, we are just talking about empowering institutions, building institutions, and we have to make sure that a good governance is put in place, and then the people that are being governed must, receive the dividend of democracy. All these things, when you put them together, at least it will make the people happy. We saw the level of resentment against, the Bongo government, because when you see the rate that people are rejoicing, celebrating all over the streets of Libreville and in other cities, you now begin to wonder. This is somebody that has been in government for 12 years, and even the last election that was conducted in 2016 was highly contested against Jinping. It was highly contested. And then again, we talk about this last election of Saturdays. You look at some of the issues that that arose, talking about cutting off the internet. Then the international observers were restricted, and then there was equally strong allegations from the oppositions. I'm talking about the coffee, the night coffee, after the vote has been casted. So some of these issues, and then the announcement, you see people celebrating and rejoicing. But that's not to say that Q is good. But when you see institutions failing, you see government not doing what they are supposed to do, considering the fact that it's equally a contract, between the government and the government, and that power that has been entrusted in the first place for them to use it for the good of the people. So when you see people revolting and clamoring for a change of government, it means that maybe the democratically elected government are not doing what they're supposed to do. So I think both ECOWAS and AU should sit down and then talk to themselves to see how they can improve democracy on this part of the world. Thank you very much.
Yes. So those are key words from you, actually. How do we entrench true democracy on the African continent? It goes by, there is saying that, when the preferable is deficient, now the available becomes preferable. There can never be a vacuum in any situation from what we've seen. And if a government is deficient for a very long time, as we have heard from experts this morning, then a change will come. I know change is permanent. And if you don't change, change changes you. And when change changes you, it becomes very tough. That's analysis of one researcher based on what's happening on the African continent with respect to coup d'etats. Now, let's come to Dr. Omale. What do you make of all of this? Put them into context, vis-a-vis information given to us by George, Dr. Keshi here, Ambassador Keshi rather, and again, Dr. Ono.
Thank you very much, Kirian. From what all the speakers before me have said, it is clear that there's a problem in Africa. There's a problem of good governance. There's a problem of the practice of democracy. Democracy, just like Dr. Ono say, is supposed to be put food on the table of the average people. A democracy that is not putting food on the table or is not taking care of the needs or human development of the people is a democracy that is not functioning properly. And what we witness in Africa, just like he said, is periodic elections. Democracy is not just about periodic elections. Democracy is deeper than holding periodic elections. Are the parties democratic, the political parties? Is there rule of law? Is there freedom of speech? Is there freedom of association? Is there a level playing field for political actors? All these are the indices that are lacking in many of these countries that are experiencing what is going on. We are not even talking about the level of poverty, the level of unemployment, the literacy level, and all the other problems combined. So it's a very, just like speaker before me has said, it's a very, very complex situation. And as Africans, the African Union, the ECOWAS, and other regional bodies, they need to, rather than just condemning and saying that they are going to invade or institute constitutional government, they have to sit down and look at the whole gamut of our practice of democracy in the continent. Because a democracy that will make somebody stay in power for 40 years, 30 years, 20-something years is not good enough. The idea of democracy is that even if there's going to be periodic elections, I think in advanced countries, there are term limits. I don't see any reason why after 5 years, 6 to 10 years, whatever idea you have or whatever program that you have, you cannot finish it within that time and allow another person to come in. So you see the trend of what is happening. Outside in the Sahel, where they have their own peculiar insurgency and so on, most of the coups are being precipitated by sit-tight syndrome. And you see most of the sit-tight leaders, like Ambassador Jokeshi said, they are already jittery. Because if you look at the pattern of the coup, you will see that it is insiders within the presidential villa that are taking over. If you look at Sudan, if you look at Gabon, is the head of the Republican Guard. So something fundamental is wrong. Is that the people in Africa, the people have not been able to organize themselves as civil society to really fight for their liberty, to fight for their rights. The democratic space has been so shrunk in such a way that the people cannot rise up to defend democracy the way they should. Most of the democratic institutions are not functioning the way it should be. The courts, the judiciary, they are not functioning the way they should function. And that is why we are experiencing this. So at the end of the day, the military, because of they have the instrument of coercion, they rise up as an alternative to ordinarily what the people themselves did, because power, they say, really belongs to the people. The people are supposed to lead the charge where things are not going right, and then ensure that the needful is done. And when there are elections, the most important thing is the neutrality of the electoral empire. And if the electoral empire is not neutral, as we have witnessed in the case of Gabon, where internet was cut off before the election, where the results had been disputed.
There was curfew.
There were curfew on the day of election, and then Ali Bongo being declared with 60-point-something percentage of the votes against Albert Ondo, who has about 30-something%. So definitely the eruption in Libreville and other towns, and what we are seeing in the photograph, is a long year of bottled up anger in the people, and they saw the military now as the messiah that have come to save them from the bongos. And as Ambassador Jokeshi said, I had a mixed feeling when I watched the video of Ali Bongo. I sympathize with him, and it shows that power is really transient. And when you are opportune to be in position of power, you should know that one day events like this can happen. I saw him as really humbled and begging for people to shout. I don't understand what he really meant by people shouting.
He said they should make some noise.
Okay, or people make some noise. So honestly, it's most unfortunate, and I wish the AU, I wish the ECOWAS and other African leaders will take a cue. Like Ambassador Jokeshi said, areas where there have not been a genuine practice of democracy, they should begin to carry out serious reforms. In the 90s, when the wave of democracy swept across Africa, we thought that there were going to be hope. But 20, 30 years down the line, we are not seeing the tangible benefit of this wave of democracy that swept across the continent.
All right, Dr. Omale, thank you very much. What you just said now, the last point, valid, of course, as well as what you also drew our attention to. I've said on Good Morning Nigeria a couple of times that in the early 90s, when the wave of democracy was sweeping across Africa with constitutional conferences and so on and so forth, the late Professor Claude Ake delivered the Guardian annual lecture, and the title of that lecture was, "Is Africa Democratizing?" 30 years later, you can still pose that question. And of course, we are seeing the consequences. George Ola Davis, still with us via Zoom from Paris. We're coming to you at this time. We've seen some footage, of course, one of them Omale referred to earlier, with the ousted president calling on his friends to make some noise. That's one leg. We also saw ordinary folks who apparently spontaneously poured out onto the streets in jubilation following the ouster of the Bongo dynasty. But I'm a bit curious, because sometimes, yes, the view from the street may not coincide with the view amongst the intelligentsia. What are knowledgeable persons, if you have an idea, thinking at this time? Is there a coincidence between perhaps their thinking or their framing of the developments with what you are seeing with the spontaneous jubilation by ordinary folks on the streets?
Well, I've witnessed at least 20 coups on the African continent, and I've been in countries where there had been coups. I'd never seen anyone that came out without jubilation the very first day. We don't need to go far off. We go back to Niger a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, Guinea, Mali, all the others that we have witnessed, including those in Sierra Leone. I was privileged to have been there when we had the very first coup as a very young boy. Everybody jubilated. But we all saw that military intervention is not normally the course action to end democracy, and everybody will condemn it. But did they condemn things when they were going wrong in the country? Hardly ever did they. And the people will be struggling in their countries. They would be clamoring for changes, and these changes are not coming. The previous speakers had made serious observations that we should look at on the African continent, which is not working. One, if you have a constitution that tells you should be there for 2 terms, why go beyond 2 terms and organize what they call referendum to extend their term in office? That does not help. If we don't hear about countries like Botswana or Namibia, it's because things are working in those countries. For instance, Mozambique, Chissano left, and he's been in and out of the country, a free man working for the African continent. In Botswana, for instance, the president at one point, Saketumile Masire, resigned his job right in the middle of his term. Why? He said, I think it is better now for the younger ones to take this democracy and go forward. Let me go to my farm. He did. And people were clamoring for him to come back. He said, no, my term is done. I'm finished with it. I'm not away from politics. I can advise. But let us progress and see democracy take its course differently with different people at different times. Now, in 1990 or 1991, I was at the La Baule conference when François Mitterrand said, democratize and we assist you. And then the succession of national conferences started. I was in Zaire, at the time Zaire, Central Africa Republic. Even in Gabon, they had national conferences that they held. What did this give us? What did they give us? Not much. Congo is still in transition. That was the only country that had one president and 4 vice presidents in the whole world. It was said to be a platter for them to change so that there could be some democracy. Do we still have it? Perhaps lastly, I don't know whether presidents like Paul Biya, Sassou Nguesso, Nguema, and Museveni slept last night. They may have rotated their their military guys, but the thoughts of the people will tell them stories in the future. Don't forget, we had Ceausescu. He was strong, even possibly stronger than all of them. And what happened to Ceausescu? Let's continue to look at that.
All right, George, permit me to stay with you now that you have touched on other African countries that you visited. You are a vast journalist, and I'd like you to look into the aspect of governments trying to be in perpetuity in Africa. You have been around Africa, so you perhaps understand the culture, behavioral pattern of some African countries, and what leads to this issue of perpetuity in government. And again, the winner in any African country becomes the Lord. Now, what about relationship between some African countries and their former colonial masters? Could that be part of the reason or part of the causative factors that's necessitating persons like Paul Biya, you've mentioned, being in power for over 4 decades? Now, if democracy has to do with someone being in power for too long, why is it then that those European countries that colonized these African countries are not advising the leaders on the better way to practice democracy, which of course is alien to Africa? Yes. So what do you make of the fabric of entire African society with respect to leadership, politics, election, life, and living? Let's share your experience very briefly, if you will.
Should the Europeans continue to think for us? Should they continue to advise us as to what to do? Can't we see for ourselves what should be better for us? Do we have to be in power for life and don't prepare for succession? There are dangerous trends that we will be seeing in the future in those countries that haven't prepared. DR Congo is a classic example where Mobutu Sese Seko was there and was not preparing for any succession until Laurent Désiré Kabila did what he did and came into a country that was disgruntled. Many people were disgruntled. Not everything that he did in that country was bad, but the fact that he did not prepare for the future, he did not prepare future leaders, is making the DRC what it is today. We will say the same for Denis Sassou Nguesso. Sassou Nguesso had been in power for so long, with the exception of when Pascal Lissouba took over. Nothing much has been done. We revere these leaders. We are clamoring for them. We cry to them. We stoop to them without thinking. The younger politicians or the younger people in the armed forces are now coming in and saying they want to change. But are we looking ourselves? Are we looking into ourselves? Should we be looking outside for this kind of help that we need from the colonial masters? I think when we went to school in class 1 up to secondary school, we learned something. And if we learned something, we should purge out those things that we learned for us, for our country, for our countries, for our continent. Do we do that? I don't think we're really doing that. We say the African Union should come together. We say the African Union, and we mainly talk about ECOWAS out there in West Africa. We don't look at what SADC is doing in its own region or COMESA in its own region. All these are areas that we should be looking at so that we can pull ourselves together on the continent. We don't need to copy what the developed world is doing, but we definitely need to look at them and say, are they doing it? They're getting ahead. They're moving. This government came, it had its own policy, and it worked out. The European Union came together, but there are so many countries within the European Union, and everybody is furthering their own interests within the European Union, even though it is a bloc, and they're getting along. No military is coming over to take over from them, because there is that thing which is called democracy. We are talking about electoral commissions. Do we have electoral commissions in these countries? No, we have supporters. We have people that are supporting us, that we should stay in power, and then we put them there. And when we put them there, they do what we call rigging for us. There were results that came out in the Gabonese stanza now, which spoke differently from what we saw being announced or what we had being announced 2 hours prior to the coup. It happened in other countries. Why can't we find systems where we don't use to, we should not be running to these electoral commissions that are being set up so that we see democracy moving? It is working in a place like Botswana. They don't have...
George Oladavis, thank you very much there for the response to the question posed by my colleague, Kyria. We'll come back to you in the course of the conversation. Let's return to our studios here. Ambassador Joe Keshi. Gabon has happened while we are still grappling with Niger. Diplomatically, does this compound the measures being contemplated by ECOWAS, the AU, and indeed some in the international community? Gabon is not part of ECOWAS, certainly, but does it complicate matters?
Not really. Not really, because number one, if you noticed, ECOWAS seems to have diplomatically backed out of military intervention, which was, what it tried to promote, but later began to deny that that wasn't their original intention, that they wanted to pursue the diplomatic, option. The AU, even though the AU was at the ECOWAS summit here in Abuja over Niger, when the AU met in Addis Ababa, it took a different position and opted for the diplomatic option. So I want to believe also that the same diplomatic option will be pursued. Look, this is almost becoming classic. A coup takes place. African leaders condemn it, and then everybody moves on. That's exactly what you're going to see again. But one of the things that George said, which is true, that it's been reported early this morning, was the outcome of that, election. And so if I was to advise AU, in the negotiation with the military, can they go ahead and announce the result of the election and install the winner of that election, if as long as it's not Bongo? Because the result that are coming out shows that Bongo probably didn't win. But again, look, I keep making this point. If elections are beginning to create crisis, we should focus on how to ensure that we have a very good election at every point. Because he mentioned Namibia. I was in Namibia for the very first independent election. And after the election, I went to see the leader of the opposition, DTA,
Democratic
Toy Alliance. Nice gentleman then. And I said to him, here we are, elections have taken place, what are your thoughts? He said, no, we are okay, no problem, because he said the system went on as we expected. It was organized by the United Nations, supported by the African Union. Everybody who was supposed to vote, voted. The votes were properly counted, of course supervised, by a lot of observers. And the result was welcomed by everybody. No opposition, nobody went to court. So if you do not have that, we can't have the United Nations running around Africa organizing elections. Even if United Nations organize election here, it will fail. Because of state capture. Because our leaders, even in this country, have captured the system. It is difficult for new entrants to break in. He was talking of succession. There is no African leader that prepares for that in this part of the world. Perhaps again out there in East and Southern Africa, where they have tried consistently to remain within the term limits. So diplomatically, I think there are openings if we want to, get the military. And the sooner the better. Again, why did I say the sooner the better? To send a message to the military that will not allow you to stay for that long. Because if you begin to allow the military to stay for that long, the danger is that, look, it's not as if the military is better, by the way. But the danger is that it would also, like it happened, in the years gone by, it would also begin to entice other military to do the same thing, particularly in environments that the people are not happy with electoral results, or they are not happy with the situation in the country. And that's why I keep saying to everybody, we should expect more coups, because things are not working well in this part of the world. And it could happen anytime. Was it not less than 3 weeks we spoke here? And I said, look, it's going to happen somewhere else. It has happened. And I make that point again, that it could happen anywhere. Except, of course, our leaders begin to really take some steps to change direction. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening immediately. Instead of doing that, what is the man in Cameroon doing? Reshuffling the military. That's not the issue. What is the guy in Uganda doing? The same thing. In fact, changing the military or reshuffling the military could actually precipitate a coup. Could actually lead to a coup as we speak. So they need to begin this idea. You have ruled for 40 years, for goodness sake. What is the problem? What else do you want to do? You've lived in this palace for 40 years. You should be tired and move on to something else. And the problem sometimes, even here, you could see somebody is chief of staff, commissioner, governor, back to minister, now senator. The next thing, they are again planning to run for the presidency, even though they were failures where they came from in the first instance.
Okay.
So it's a problem.
Yes, it is.
So we really must, And I think we should not leave this conversation alone to the leaders, because if you leave this conversation alone to the leaders, we are getting nowhere. The people themselves must begin to see that they should challenge their leaders to do the right thing.
Okay. All right. We appreciate your contributions, and let's return to Lagos. Where we have Dr. Kester Ono. See, gentlemen, there's this four-way test, by the Rotary International. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? And will it build goodwill and better friendships? And the most important aspect, will it be beneficial to all concerned? African leaders are not living outside African society. We live with them, and all of this applies to our daily lives. And let me bring in the idea of the regulatory resolutions of the African Union, the implementing modalities. When someone changes a constitution of his country through what they call referendum, he takes a third time. And when a coup occurs in another country, same person will now begin to condemn the coup. So who is following who, so to speak? And now, Dr. Ono, what sense do you make of this? That when Ambassador Keshe was talking about people staying in power for 40 years, is this some level of mental illness, so to speak, for you to be in power for 40 years in a country that have millions of people? No other person is qualified to be in power. Is it part of what my friend Lord Lugard said, that the African men, we are greedy. We are greedy. And the African man would like to marry 1 to 10 wives, build palaces and enjoy his life. Is that what is playing out? And again, what is the way out?
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's a sheer greed in the first place, but not greed per se. Because if you look at the type of leaders that we have in this part of the world, they place a very high premium on political powers, and especially they see it as, as everything, because once you get to power, you use it to do whatever you want to do. Nobody can check you. Just like Claude Ake said, in a Democracy and Development, one of his book, he said that the premium that African leaders placed on power is unparalleled. And just like he said that when we talk about democracy in this part of the world, that democracy is more apparent than real. Like a few years ago, I saw when France and US intervened in Côte d'Ivoire to save democracy. And at the end of the day, Ouattara was sworn in as the president of Côte d'Ivoire. Just imagine the same person that both US and France fought for to entrench into government. Now he has to change constitution for him to go for the third term. And you look at other places, just like Ambassador Keshe said, you look at Anjoy, you see Cameroon. Even though the person is not fit again to become the president, the person is still running. And we are now witnessing situation not even running. You now see them entrenching their children and their cronies. If you look at what is happening in Gabon, you realize that the father died in office. That was in 2009. And the speaker supposed to take over. But within just few months, the main party, that is Gabon is the Democratic Party, or Democratic Party of Gabonese, now brought him again. And not just that, even since then, since 1968, they had a one-party system, which means, and if you look at the enormous power he is the one that has the power that control over both the judiciary and the legislative. And beside that, he is the one that appoints the prime minister, and he has the power to dissolve the legislative and equally postpone legislation. So when you look at the C-type nature of African leaders, it keeps us wondering. And again, there's something very, very important we fail to realize. this globalization of information system. The world has become a global village. So whatever, anything that, other things that are happening in other parts of the world, we are equally following, and there are actually an increase in the number of civil society organizations all over Africa. So some of the activities of these African leaders are being checkmated, considering the fact that they are not even, helping the matter. People that we are placed or put in place of governance, they're not even using that power for them to govern the people very well. So people are now beginning to agitate and to ask questions. There are obviously ways that we can come out of sit-tight, government. If we can entrench strong institutions, because it looks as if once you become the president of a country, you control both the judiciary, the legislative, all the machineries of governance. But those that, actually talk about democracy, we are talking about the check and the balances, where you have separation of power between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. And there will be check and balance, whereby each organ will be checking each other. But if you look at, African system, you realize that that check and balance has eroded the system. So once somebody found himself as an executive, he controls all the machineries of governance. And it's not good in that way, because there is nobody to check the person. And in a situation whereby the people are looking up to judiciary, looking up to legislative for them to perform their work effectively, and they fail the people, then the people now see the military as the arbiter, which is not so. Because we've equally seen the military, taking over power. They've not actually done more to change the life of the people. You may not blame them, because leadership is not part of their training. I mean, that governance is not part of their training, because they are trained to fight or to defend the territorial integrity of the country. But to where the leaders that are supposed, or the politicians that are supposed to perform their job in the right way, when they fail, the military now use that opportunity to come in. You can see the new regime that have come to govern, that have just entered into Gabon. They are now calling themselves a committee for transition, of institutions. Just imagine, that is the maybe responsibility that the politicians supposed to have done. They have now come to change the institution, to build institutions for us. So if
all right, Dr. Kester Ono, thank you very much there for the points that you have raised. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, we'll continue with the conversation.
The job of making Nigeria great is my ambition, is my dream, to renew the hope of Nigerians, to really bring about changes that will promote unity, equity, stability, and prosperity for this country. It's not a one-man's job. It's a job of all of us.
You're welcome back, and it's still Good Morning Nigeria on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. I want to return to Dr. Matthew Omale. There is concern, and from what you gentlemen have also said in the course of the conversation this morning, that democracy is challenged on the African continent. And it appears that the mere equation of democracy to periodic elections, whether free, fair, credible, would not now appear to be sufficient. There are also governance issues. But I think that as part of the granular approach to this, particularly for, as Ambassador Keshi said, those international institutions that now cry routinely and condemn unconstitutional change of governments, ECOWAS, for instance, and the AU, to say, look, let's begin to take a look at what we mean by democracy. Yes, it is true that a constitution is not cast in stone. And from time to time, a constitution, because of the dynamic nature of society, can be altered. And this is part of what a number of these dictators have done. They have also they have utilized provisions from their existing constitutions to change the constitutions and get extended term limits. But listening to what, for instance, happened in Gabon, look, the key ingredients of democracy, key ingredients, apart from elections, we talk about the rule of law and then separation of powers. So where you will have the executive, who is also literally in charge of the legislature, also literally in charge of the judiciary, is it not time for international institutions on the African continent to now, as part of the revision of the protocols, to frown at this? You can't concentrate all powers in a person's hands and say, look, the president has powers to dissolve the executive, the president has powers to sack the judges, and they can be at his beck and call. All those do not appear to square with democracy. Are these the granular matters that these international bodies should now begin to take a look at, considering the flagrant abuses that we have seen that have also, in some instances, occasioned the unconstitutional change of government?
Yes, thank you very much, Kingsley. You see, most of the international organizations, international bodies on the continent, they have a lot of protocols. For example, ECOWAS. ECOWAS has a protocol on good governance, on political development. This protocol spells out clearly how countries are supposed to practice their democracy. The EU also have the African peer review mechanisms and other instruments that they have put in place to assess development. We also look at NEPAD, which has a very important component. So they have these institutions in place. But the major problem is, how can you be a judge in your own case? Most of the leaders, as you see, as have been enumerated by speakers on this platform, have almost the same characteristics of seat tightness and so on. So these protocols or these instruments that have been laid out, they are the same people who will sit down and are supposed to now implement these protocols. And because it affects them, they might not be able to have the political will to ensure that these protocols are enforced to the latter. That is one of the major reasons. You can imagine, apart from Nigeria that has been vociferous in organizing and marshalling opposition against what is happening in Niger and some other places, some of the countries have a lukewarm attitude because of, it's not like a kettle calling a pot black. Some of them are deeply guilty of usurping constitutional government indirectly through flawed elections, through so many undermining the constitution and so on. And then you want the same people again to go to a meeting of either ECOWAS or a meeting of the African Union and then to begin to talk against themselves. So I think they
will have to be compelled to. Otherwise, the contagion is unlikely to end. Yeah, many will argue.
The only way we can compel them is if the civil society are up and alive. Because, of course, all the countries are independent and democratic. They are sovereign. So there's a limit the international body can go. There's a limit. So most of them have a vice-like grip on their countries. And when they go to the international forum of, let's say, ECOWAS or SADC or whatever, their regional bodies, you still discover that most of them, they have the majority. I don't want to start mentioning who is where now. If you take Nigeria out, Nigeria and probably Ghana, and maybe to some extent Cote d'Ivoire, look at the rest countries in West Africa. If you take a critical look at them, you discover that they are almost the same thing that we are complaining about. Even where there are democracy, you discover that they are the ones changing constitution. So they outnumber even the ones that are supposed to push for this democratic practice.
I think the question that you are answering, makes a lot of sense, and like George, now that we're trying to manage the time that we have to also come in there, and that has to do with the AU and its own deficiencies as well. George, you give examples of Namibia and Botswana. These are countries I rarely hear about these days. But from what you have said, it does appear that these two countries are practicing democracy as it were. Now, looking at AU as a body under which every African country belongs, how come the AU protocol or the AU instruments, did not cover the aspect of good governance properly? It may be indicated, especially in ECOWAS. What I'm trying to ask you is to see, why is it that leaders in African countries who perpetuate themselves in power, which does not translate to democracy, leaders in Africa who change constitution by a kangaroo referendum and remain in power, who are members of the AU, attend AU meetings, why should those elements be allowed to attend AU meeting when they have gone against the tenets of democracy? And do you think that AU or ECOWAS require reform of sorts, so it can be reformed to say, look, if you go against any of the instruments or protocols, we are cutting you off until you return to proper democracy? Is it a possibility?
Well, diplomatically, that could be done. Practically, I don't see how it is going to be effective. I cut you off from what we're doing. Okay, so I cease my payment from your body. How will I continue? How will the running off the African Union continue? The African Union, ECOWAS, CEMAC are not strong enough. SADC has been something, and we could look at that in future, that they have been progressing much more than we have been in West Africa. Don't forget, when ECOWAS was set up in 1975, it was supposed to be for the economic community. We only started putting things together to cover politics in there, which is still not even working, after there were lots and lots of political maneuvers within the 16 country then, and later 15 countries of ECOWAS. How can the AU enact any of its protocol when, in fact, in itself, it cannot really go to this country to see how they can contribute, to see how they can actually help the country to forge ahead, like the United Nations did in Namibia? By the way, I was there, and I had that congratulatory message to Sam Nujoma when he won the elections. And that is also the vogue in a country like Botswana. They finish election at 6 o'clock in the evening. Counting starts. And at 8 p.m., during the news, in a vast country like that, you hear the opposition coming on board to say, congratulations, we wish you good luck. I remember also somebody saying in the Philippines, I could fully remember, if there's any election on the country, or anywhere, and nobody talks about rigging, well, that was not an election. But it is so much, it is too much in Africa. We don't have institutions that can tell us that we are not doing it the right way. We have to punish you. We have to do whatever it is for you to do it the right way. Let us be careful. West Africa, we have more elections coming in again within the next 2 years.
All right, George. George, very quickly, we're pressed for time so that we can also get the closing thoughts of the other guests. There have been some comments in some quarters, and others have rebutted those comments as being somewhat exaggerated. What we have seen in terms of the takeover of government in former French colonies. Does this, as it were, in your opinion, mark the end, formal end of the policy of assimilation? Look at the way Niger is reacting. Look at the way Mali has reacted. In other words, is France finally beginning to lose control of its former colonies?
They're not only beginning to lose, they have been losing. And I think there is going to be continuity in this process. They have definitely been losing. And in a way, they have also been trying to pull out from them. They've got strong links with countries like Senegal, Gabon, Côte d'Ivoire, and then Chad. But you could see in other countries, including Djibouti, where they've lost lots and lots of weight. The Americans have getting over to take Djibouti, where they had a very strategic point for marine purposes. They have been losing. They have not only started losing.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Keshi, your final thoughts on the matter. The coup has taken place, and of course, Bongo is in detention or house arrest. Returning him to power perhaps is not a possibility for now. How would AU and ECOWAS, well, ECOWAS is not part of this. How will AU engage? Better way to engage the junta?
You know, I think I have said in the course of this conversation that maybe they should do one or two things. Either they have a rerun election, or they ask the electoral office to do the right thing and announce the proper election. If perchance the opposition won, so be it. Let the leader of the opposition or the presidential candidate assume office. In that way, you shorten the military, you shorten military rule. Because, you know, we must also remember from history, the fact that you have a military government taking place is not El Dorado, it's not Uhuru. It's not as if, oh, all of a sudden things have changed. The truth of the matter is that if it stays too long, there might even be a coup against the same military, again, as we have seen. So the best way to do is to persuade the people to say, let's not, look, we don't want to do A, B, C, D, but let's do, see how we can resolve this issue very quickly.
All right, thank you indeed. Gentlemen, it's been wonderful talking to you this morning on this very important topic. First, let me appreciate George Ola Davis from Paris, veteran Sierra Leonean journalist and an international political negotiator. We want to thank you immensely, George, for waking up with us this morning on our show. Thank you. All right. Dr. Kester Honor, Senior Research Fellow, Nigerian Institute of International Affairs and visiting lecturer at the Institute of Peace, Security and Development at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University, Awka. We thank you. We thank you for your thoughts and for your time as well. We'd also like to appreciate Dr. Adoyi Matthew Omale. He's a lecturer at the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy at the Base University. Thank you. Ambassador Keshi of all times, we always appreciate you. Seasoned diplomat and former permanent secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs. I will thank you as always.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
That's it for us on Good Morning Nigeria today. Thank you for tuning in. Tomorrow is yet another day, same time, 7 o'clock in the morning. Until then, as I always say, look after yourselves. I'm Kingsley Osadolo.
And I am Kirian Umayo. Do have a great day.